Freud. There is not much stock put in Freud stuff these days for a number of reasons. For example, it's very low in terms of researchability, so most of Freud's stuff cannot be tested. That of course means that it also can't be falsified, but it is generally found to be not all that useful. However, it's still taught, and often taught to a larger or deeper extent than some of the other theories. So you still find Freud in all intro psych courses, for example, or counselling courses, and so on. There's a number of reasons why it's still taught. One is that it's at its core, it's all about sex and aggression, and as you would know, sex and aggression sells. There are always movies raking in big money at the cinema that have sex and aggression. In fact, one of the more recent ones had both of those things at its core. 50 Shades of Boring. It's also, Freud also had an interest in dreams, and everybody has an interest in dreams. Everybody is interested in finding out what their dreams mean, and so on, and so that makes it attractive and interesting. A lot of Freud stuff has become part of everyday language, and as we go through, I'll point out, if I remember, I'll point out a couple of terms that we use in everyday use, that we use in everyday language, that came from Freud's ideas, Freud's writings. It is also still taught because Freud had a lot of followers. In fact, to some extent, still does. And so a lot of the psychiatric stuff uses a lot of Freud's original material, Freud's ideas and concepts, etc. And Freud was at the start of psychology in a lot of ways, and a lot of those who followed him, so Adler and Erickson and Jung, some of which we'll talk about later in the semester, they started with his ideas. So they travelled to Vienna to study with him, to learn from him, to work with him, and so on, because he was there. He was there first. He was writing in this area first, and so on. And a lot of them adopted his ideas and built their own around it. And as we go through, you'll see in a number of the other topics that we cover, there are echoes and hints and so on of Freud stuff. Freud stuff is also still taught because of the depth and breadth of it. Considering it was based on only a very small number of individual case studies, Freud stuff is terribly detailed. So he had ideas, thoughts, theories and so on about pretty much everything to do with psychology. And so that depth and breadth means Freud stuff is often mentioned. And it's persuasive. You will see as we go through and talk about some of the stuff, how you think, well, yeah, actually that does explain that behaviour, or that does fit my experience, etc. So it has a certain persuasive logic that just, but it's in a similar way that if you read a horoscope. So you read yesterday's horoscope at the end of the day, or today's horoscope at the end of today, and you will be able to find things that happen during the day that match your horoscope. So looking back, in the same way that people who read Nostradamus's future prediction stuff, and if you read it after things have happened, you can map things to it. It does look as though it predicted lots of stuff. Anyway, so Freud stuff is still taught. So I'm going to talk about 3 levels of consciousness, 3 components of personality, briefly mention defense mechanisms, and the psychosexual stages of development. Oh, and you all will have seen the Rorschach ink blots based on Freud stuff. 3 levels of consciousness. All textbooks that talk about Freud stuff have a picture of an iceberg, because icebergs, so this is the surface of the ocean, and so icebergs always have a lot more of their bulk below the surface as above. And so it's used of Freud stuff to indicate that the bit above the surface, i.e. the bit that we can see, the bit that we can that others see in us and so on, is the smallest component of us. So the whole iceberg is the individual from a psychological point of view. Is the individual, and this small part, the conscious, is the bit that's in contact with the outside world. So it's the stuff that others see in us, in you. It is the stuff that we are thinking about right now. It is the stuff that's at the top of your mind, etc. The next level is the preconscious. So that's stuff that's not right on the surface, but you can bring it into your consciousness if you choose. So there's stuff you can start thinking about. So if I asked you what you had for lunch yesterday, for example, you probably weren't thinking about what you had for lunch yesterday before I asked that question, but having asked it, you can now think about it. So you can now remember back to yesterday and think about what you had for lunch, and maybe picture it in your head. Remember who you were with when you were eating lunch, what it tasted like, what it felt like to eat, and all that sort of stuff. So all that material, all that information, all that stimulus, all that stimuli, was in there, in your mind. But it wasn't at the top of your mind. It was sort of just below the surface, but easy enough for you to start thinking about. The bulk of your psyche is the unconscious, and so that's stuff at a deeper level that you don't have access to. That's stuff that, according to the theory, that's stuff that we can access, but you'll need help from a psychiatrist, for example. And so, there is a reason why that's not easily accessed, and that's because it contains all sorts of dark stuff. It contains aggressive impulses. It contains negative thoughts about others. It contains all sorts of stuff that you really don't want to be thinking about, or shouldn't be thinking about, or you don't want others to know you're thinking about. You don't want yourself to know you're thinking about, etc. And so it's below your level of consciousness for good reason. And there are also three. So those are three levels of consciousness. I'll come back to this in a little while, because I'm about to talk about the three components of personality. So the ego, the id, and the superego. So there are three components of personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id develops first. So you are born with your id. In fact, you were born as id, all id. So the id works on what's called the life instinct. You would have heard the term libido, and that comes from Freud stuff. So Freud said that the life instinct is called libido. And so in ordinary usage of the term, that generally relates to things like sex drive and so on. And so it maps back to Freud stuff and about life and so on, because sex is all about life. Sex is how you produce life. Sex is how you connect with others, and the intimacy and so on, and feel alive, etc. So libido is the life instinct. That has two aspects: the individual and the species. So the individual is about your own life, self-preservation, and so it's doing things to make sure that you stay alive. So eating and drinking, protecting yourself, not going out into dark alleys late at night, all that sort of stuff. The species level, so it's about life of the species, and so that's the so both these things are about drives essentially. So the species level component of libido is the drive to reproduce, to produce offspring, and to continue not just your genetic legacy, but also do your part in furthering the species. Although, to be truthful, there's plenty of humans around at the moment. They're not really going to miss it if you don't have one. But we still have that drive to do so. All of Freud's stuff is about opposites. So consciousness and the unconsciousness, for example. Eros, the life instinct, also has an opposite. It's called the death instinct. It's called thanatos. So thanatos is Eros is about life, Thanatos is about the snuffing out of life. So it's generally talked about in terms of death, but in a way it's not really death. What it means is one of the problems with life is that it involves movement, it involves action, and you're always going to be doing stuff. There's always drives to satisfy. For example, your self-preservation and eating and drinking and so on, there's always needs to fulfill. Relationships, etc. So it's work, it's effort. Thanatos is about not having to put in that effort anymore. So it's having all your needs satisfied. So it's like being in a state of complete peace and satisfaction and contentment. And really, there's only one way of satisfying that, and that's in death. So it's only in death that you no longer have needs to satisfy, to fulfill drives, etc. And so Thanatos is the drive, the underlying motivation to be free of all those needs. So another way of talking about it is the idea of a non-existence, a nothingness, a void, i.e. so a lack of things that are driving you. Eros drives our behaviour. So forming relationships, etc. Thanatos also drives our behaviour. And you see that, for example, or Freud would say, you see that, for example, in teenagers who are taking risks. You see that in self-destructive behaviour like smoking, speeding, not exercising. Is there anything that puts you at risk, or anything that causes you damage or harm or whatever, is driven by your Thanatos. And you can either express your Thanatos inward, so it's about you, or outward, so you can be aggressive towards others and so on. And it can either take physical or non-physical forms. So physical forms, so being aggressive towards others, picking fights, drinking alcohol, or smoking, and so on. So that's physical. But it's also, you can also do it in a non-physical manner and in an inward manner, for example, by thinking negative thoughts about yourself. And plenty of people are plagued by negative thoughts about themselves, and thinking that they are no good, they won't amount to anything, they will fail, they're not. How many of you are thinking you're not going to do well on the first assignment? Freud would say, and thinking that, hoping, I just hope I'll pass this subject, I hope I do okay, and so on. All that sort of self-defeating thinking, Freud would say, is driven by your Thanatos. Sadomasochism, so that's like a neat summary of both the life instinct, because it's about sex, and the death instinct, because of the aggressive nature of it. The id is driven by the pleasure principle. So the id is all about maximising pleasure immediately and minimising pain, because pain is unpleasant, etc. And so babies who are all id are all about pleasure immediately. So if a baby wants something, so it wants to be picked up, wants to be changed, wants to be fed, or whatever, it will let its mother know, or its primary caregiver, whoever feeds it, it will let it know, and it will yell until it gets fed. And so this baby is driven by pleasure, because having your hunger satisfied, or being picked up when you're cold or lonely, being soothed when you're scared, and so on. These are pleasurable in the same way that when you're hungry and you eat, you experience a sense of pleasure that you have eaten. When you're thirsty and you drink, you experience a sense of pleasure having had a drink, etc. For example, it's a hot day, you haven't had a lot to drink, and you have a drink of cool water, and it tastes good. Whereas if it wasn't such a hot day, and if you're not as thirsty, that water doesn't taste as good. It's just water. So you can get pleasure from satisfying these needs. So that's the id. The ego develops during childhood. The ego works on the reality principle, reality as in the real world. And so it's logical, it's rational. Its purpose as a component of your psyche, of your personality, of you, its purpose is to satisfy the needs of the id and the constraints of the real world. So the id is all about pleasure. If there wasn't some pleasure in life, there wouldn't be much point. There'd be no desire to go on unless you enjoyed life, unless you got something out of it. And so the id has to be satisfied from time to time. So the id has to get some of what it wants, some of what it of what's driving it, because we all have to experience pleasure from time to time. And so it's the ego's job to allow some pleasure within the constraints of the real world. The ego wants to minimize punishment, so it has a defensive element to it. There are several types of anxieties, and the text talks about three, but I'm just going to talk about two. So anxiety is, from Freud's point of view, is a feeling that you might receive punishment, or that you might experience guilt. And I'll talk about guilt in a moment. Neurotic anxiety, anxiety and fear are the same thing. Fear is when you have, there's some sort of danger, and it's right there, it's imminent, you can see it. So for example, it's a snarling dog, or a magpie sitting in the tree in springtime. It's standing outside the room before you start your exam, or whatever. So it's something that's definite, concrete, something, and you know that that's what you are worried about, that you are fearful for, and so on. Anxiety, however, is similar sorts of feelings, but it's about something that may or may not happen. So something that's not directly in front of you right now. So for example, you can experience anxiety about something that's a long time in the future, or something that might be in the future but may not ever happen. Neurotic anxiety is when you don't know what you are anxious about. You just know that you're anxious. And indeed there's a category, a class of disorders in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, so mental disorders, that are the anxiety disorders. And that's basically about, like, for example, one of them is generalized anxiety disorder, where you are anxious all the time, but you don't know why. So you don't know why you're worried, just that you're worried all the time. And so because you don't know what you're worried about, Freud would say, well, whatever it is you're worried about must be coming out of your unconscious, i.e. the thing that you can't access, you can't look at, you can't analyze. And the id is powerful. The unconscious is powerful. It's such a big chunk of that iceberg. And so, not unreasonably, we have an underlying fear that we might lose control over our id and all the things that might happen if that was to be the case. Another kind of anxiety is moral anxiety, and that is when they're a similar sort of thing, except the fear is in relation to the superego. And I'll talk about the superego in just a moment. The ego has a system of functions, of mechanisms that are designed to help reduce anxiety, and they're called the defense mechanisms. And I'll just show you briefly the defense mechanisms shortly. So the third component of personality is the superego. So the superego develops later in childhood, and I'll talk about that. I'm going to talk about a lot in a moment, I guess. And it works on the morality principle or the idealistic principle, depending on which textbook you're reading. And it's basically about what society, what culture expects from its members. You get your superego from your parents. So you learn, the first place you learn about society and culture and so on is from your family, from your parents. And so your superego will be very much like your parents' superego. And I'll talk about that shortly as well. There are two parts to the superego. There's the conscience and the ego ideal. So the conscience is all about the things that you should not do. They're the don'ts. And if you do it, if you do something you're not supposed to do, something that society frowns upon, then you experience anxiety and so on about guilt, about the possibility of being punished, etc. And so the purpose of our conscience is to guide our behaviour based on the worry that we would be punished if we did something wrong. The ego ideal is about the things we should do. So as a good contributing member of society, the things that you should do to fit in, and so on. So for example, conscience, don't take advantage of others. Ego ideal, help others. So you see, one is about avoidance, don't take advantage of others, and the other is about having to do something, so helping others. It's an active thing. If you're so each of these components, the ego and superego, so they're separate, and it's kind of like three chunks in your mind, and they have different strengths. If your superego is too strong, then you can develop a sense of inferiority. You would have heard the term inferiority complex, and I think we cover Adler, and I want to talk about that a bit more when we cover Adler stuff. But the inferiority complex, from Freud's point of view, is basically that you don't measure up to what society, what your parents, what family expects of you, i.e. you are not measuring up to your superego. Alright, so I mentioned it as sort of three chunks. The ideal is this one. So the middle one is the ego, and then the id and the superego, because the ego's function is ego works to interact with the real world. And so ideally the ego will be the strongest component. The ego, its job is basically to walk the line between the id, so pleasure, immediate pleasure, and the superego, what you should and shouldn't do, etc., and allow both. So allow you some pleasure, but without getting in trouble. Do the right thing, and feeling good for it, etc. Prisons, Freud would say, prisons are full of people who are dominated by their id. So they wanted something that they would find pleasurable, and they took it. And so rapists, robbers, people who assault other people, etc. So people who couldn't control their urges, couldn't control themselves, i.e. their superego was too small, and so what society was saying you should and shouldn't do was not having much of an impact. The ego wasn't strong enough to keep a handle on the id, and so the id dominated behaviour. And so that's obviously not healthy. Having a superego that's too big is also not healthy. So someone who has an overactive or an overstrong superego compared to the ego in particular, they're guilt-ridden. So they're always worried about doing the wrong thing. They're the doormats of the world. So those that others just trample on because they always say yes, they can't say no. They're the people who will always bend over backwards. They're the people who donate too much of their time and money and resources to others, etc. They're the people who are taken advantage of by those with a stronger id. So on. And you likely know people who are pleasure seekers and people who are like the guilt-ridden. And ideally, as I said before, the ego is the strongest component. Right, so that's the ego, the super ego. So the super ego, because you have, well, so the ego is mostly conscious and the pre-conscious. There's not much unconscious aspect to the ego because it deals with the real world, and so it interacts with others and society, etc. The id is all unconscious. The things that are driving your pleasure and so on. So, for example, you want something, but you don't necessarily know what's driving. What underlying thing is driving that need, that want? The superego, all three aspects of consciousness, because the superego has to interact with the real world, because you have to get your morals from somewhere, and you have to be able to think about and decide whether or not this behaviour you're contemplating is the right thing or not, i.e. whether your conscience would have trouble with you doing it or not, whether you would get praise for it or not, etc. Alright, so the defence mechanisms, I'm not going to go through them, and this is just a short, and there's just some of them, there are stacks of them, and so their purpose is to protect the ego, as I said before. So for example, rationalisation, when you justify your behaviour in more acceptable terms. Denial, so for example, you refuse to accept you have cancer. Regression, projection, reaction formation, displacement, you likely will have heard of. Sublimation, regression to an earlier stage of development. So you likely have heard of a number of these, and so they are elements of the ego's toolbox, essentially, to help protect your psyche from anxiety, to help your ego stay strong, and to be able to walk the line between the id and the superego, to allow you some pleasure but not too much, to allow you to fit within society by doing the right thing and following your conscience, etc. Alright, psychosexual stages of development. They are focused on what are known as erogenous zones. So that's another term that's in the common usage, and generally in relation to sexual pleasure. And so the term erogenous zone comes from Freud stuff, and he didn't use it so much in terms of sexual pleasure, but certainly in terms of pleasure. At each stage of development there is conflict, and in fact throughout Freud stuff there is conflict. So there's constant conflict between the ego and the superego, and that's not a bad thing, that's necessary, because through conflict you get energy to run your psyche, so to run your mental system. So the conflict between the superego, the ego and the id, conflict between the unconscious, the conscious and the pre-conscious, conflict in terms of the anxieties I mentioned before, and so on. All conflict is not a bad thing, unless it causes you problems, and at that point then you, according to Freud stuff anyway, you need therapy. Anyway, so the stages of development are also about conflict. You can get fixation. So fixation is when, and you would have heard of the term fixation, that's in common usage as well. Fixation is when you get stuck in a stage, essentially. And I'll give a bit more explanation of that as we go. So the oral stage of development, first year of life. So you're born oral. Not surprisingly, the erogenous zone, so the part of your body that this stage is focused on, is the mouth. And so, as I was saying before, how it's persuasive, you would know, if you've ever had or seen a baby, they put everything in their mouth. And so Freud would say, well, that's proof that the mouth is so important to babies. And so Freud said that in the oral stage, the erogenous zone, so the place of focus was the mouth, and the conflict is around feeding. To get fixated on a stage, you can either have too much or too little pleasure from whatever the erogenous zone is. So in terms of feeding. You can either get too much or too little. So, for example, the advice that midwives and mothers and grandmothers and friends and so on give about when to feed the baby kind of goes in a cycle, where sometimes it's about feeding to a schedule, and sometimes it's about feeding to demand. You would have heard of demand feeding. So demand feeding is when the underlying theory is that the baby will know when it's hungry, and it will let you know, and at that time you feed it. And indeed, mothers get very good at recognizing, so babies have different kinds of cries, and mothers get very good at recognizing the cry that means I'm hungry versus the cry that means I'm wet, or I have soiled myself, or I'm tired, I'm lonely, I'm cold, I'm in pain, etc. So there are different kinds of cries, and the research indicates that mothers are very good at recognizing the different kinds of cries of their babies. And they're also good at recognizing different kinds of cries in other babies. Fathers are not as good, but they're better than non-fathers, etc. So that's demand feeding. Schedule feeding is when when the mother is advised to feed every 3 hours or every 4 hours or 3.5 hours or whatever the particular midwife or nurse or whatever learned. And so you say, well, it's important that the baby develops properly and so on, and so it's important it gets nutrition, nourishment, and so on. And so every 3 hours, feed the baby, even if it's playing, if it seems happy or whatever, doesn't matter. Offer the breast or bottle every 3 hours or every 3 or 4 hours or 3.5 or 4 hours or whatever. And so that's feeding to a schedule. So if you're too strict, so in your schedule feeding, even if the baby's sleeping, you wake it up and feed it every 3.5 hours because you were told to, for example. And you may chuckle, but mothers have been advised to do this at various times. And so you feed to a schedule, the baby doesn't get to choose when it gets fed and so on. And so food, nutrition, and so on becomes like a tool rather than something from which to derive pleasure, as opposed to being too lax and not exerting any control over the process and allowing full control to the baby about when it gets fed and how much it gets fed, etc. And so not providing the opportunity for any pleasure, as opposed to being too much in control of pleasure. And so if either of those happens to a sufficient extent, then the person can become fixated on the oral stage. And Freud would say, if Freud was your treating psychiatrist, and for example you were a smoker, Freud would say, well, that is because you were fixated on during your oral stage of development. So anything to do with the mouth, anything that's abnormal is not the right term, but anything that's disordered or problematic or any kind of issue that's mouth related, Freud would say it goes back to the oral stage of development. So smoking, overeating, so Freud would say an obese person is fixated on the oral stage of development. Someone who can't control their gossiping, for example. Someone who chews their nails. So anything that's related to the mouth, Freud would say is about fixation of the oral stage. The anal stage of development, and you can guess what the erogenous zone is for that. So between years 1 and 3, or thereabouts, and the conflict is about toilet training. And so for toilet training, again, two extremes. So one where you, and some families, mothers, parents, whatever, do this, where in theory, if you put your child, your toddler, on the potty and they do their business and you reward them copiously for that, then you can very quickly toilet train them. But the trick is catching them and putting them on the potty at just the right time in order to do that. And so one method is to regularly put them on the potty in the hope of catching them and then rewarding them when it just happens at the right time, purely by chance. And so if you do that too much, so every 10 minutes, no matter what the toddler is doing, you pick them up, rush them to the potty and sit in there for 5 minutes, and basically saying they're removing all control from the toddler, etc. Then, and be too strict about it, you can produce an anally retentive person. So someone who's fixated on the anal stage and being anally retentive. And you would have heard the term you're anal, or you're anally retentive, or you're retentive, or whatever, and this is basically what it means. And so these are people who, because they were made to go to the toilet when they were told, and so on, and so and basically have no control over it, and so these people withhold stuff. It's kind of their reaction against being told you must go. They withhold, and so they are. Freud would say an example of someone like this is a hoarder who won't give stuff away, won't throw stuff out. So they retain it. They refuse to let it go. So Freud would say, well, it's because you got fixated in the anal stage. So it's because of your toilet training regime was too strict. Too lax, so just allowing it completely up to the child. And it was not that long ago there was this movement in the US, of course, where all these things start, this idea that well, when we're descended from apes and so on, and so when, like back in our tree dwelling time, and indeed afterwards, we didn't have nappies, so we must have learnt this in some way. So somehow it must happen naturally. And so there was this advice, this movement, there's probably a book, the idea that you essentially let your toddler run around with no nappy, and just clean up after it, with the idea that eventually nature would take its course and it would learn somehow. Don't ask me how, I didn't read the book. And so people who are given too much control as toddlers are anally expulsive. And you may have heard of there's a TV show called The Odd Couple, Felix and Unger, and I've seen recently ads about, so they've remade it with that Friends guy, Matthew Perry, and so Felix was the neat person, I think, so he was the anally expulsive, and Oscar was the expulsive person, and Felix was the neat person, I think. So Felix liked everything just so, and he was obsessive about the stuff, and so on. And so that's anally retentive. And Oscar was a slob, and didn't clean up after himself. Wasn't particularly fussed about his own grooming and so on. And so Freud would say, well, that is evidence of being an anally expulsive character. Phallic stage, which is focused on the genitals. And given the time Freud wrote this stuff, then the most important genital is of course the penis. So phallic stage rather than genitals, rather than a more non-sexist term. So between the ages of 3 and 6, you would have heard of the Oedipus complex. So boys go through the Oedipus conflict, and girls go through the electric conflict. And it's out of this that your superego develops. So what is the Oedipus complex, or the Oedipus process? So the boy, at some stage during this period, the boy notices, so up until now, as far as he's concerned, he has been the main male in his mother's life. At some stage, he notices that she also devotes time, attention, affection, and so on to his father. So he realizes he's not the only male in his mother's life, and doesn't like that. And so the way of it's not consciously thinking this stuff. It's all happening in the unconscious. And so in order to be to return to being the number one male in his mother's life, he needs to banish his father, destroy his father, kill his father, exile his father in some way, and replace him, and be everything that, from a male point of view, everything that his mother needs. So that's the desire. However, it also comes with a recognition that, because this is a kid, age about 5 years old or whatever, comes with a recognition that, well, if I tried that, he's bigger and stronger than me, my dad is bigger and stronger than me, I wouldn't succeed, I would fail. And I might be banished, I might be kicked out or whatever, or worse still, I might be castrated, so I might lose my maleness. And so obviously this wouldn't be a pleasant thing. And so the boy child drops this desire to banish and replace his father, and instead becomes more like his father, and adopts his father's views and morals and so on. And this is where the boy's super ego develops. Girl goes through a similar thing, but slightly different. So during this stage, she notices, she works out or whatever, that all the control, all the power in the family, and therefore in society, in the world and so on, is held by the males. There is one main difference between these males and her as the girl child and other women. They have a penis, and so all power must derive from having a penis, and so it's not fair that she doesn't have one, and obviously he's not going to grow one, so she feels ripped off. There is, however, a second best solution. Rather than having your own penis, if you could get control of one. And so one way of getting control of one is to gain control of your father. That would require you to displace, banish, kill, destroy, whatever, your mother. You need to replace her with yourself in order that you can get control of the penis and therefore have some power and so on in society. Again, you recognise if you took your mother on, you would lose. She's stronger than you, etc. And so you give up on that desire and instead become more like your mother. And that's where the girl's superego develops. So for both male and female, these things are not conscious. They're bubbling in your unconscious, and all those dark thoughts of destroying your father, of banishing your mother, and all that sort of stuff, you don't really want to think about. They were there, you don't really want to think about, and so they are pushed down deep into your unconscious, along with all sorts of other stuff and images and thoughts, etc. So, and that's a fairly stressful period. And so the next stage, from about 6 to puberty, called latency. Latency means rest, essentially. And so because of all the turmoil that happened in the Oedipus and Electra stuff, you repress it, and it's like a period of rest. And that goes over to about puberty, and then puberty hits, you got hormones and hair in funny places and so on, and there's like a reawakening of libido and thanatos, of the sexual instinct and aggression and so on, and you become more, you develop an interest in people of the opposite gender, and you develop a degree of risk-taking, etc. And then, according to Freud, basically from puberty onwards, you don't really change, and so all your personality, everything about your psyche and so on, is put together up until in the period between birth and adolescence, and then from then on, you don't really change.